Now the language areas in the brain have been studied for quite a while. So Broca in 1861 developed a paper based on a patient that had had a stroke. Now the stroke was here in the frontal lobe in an area right next to the motor cortex. So we see here the motor cortex, and remember the motor cortex is this gyrus right here, just in front of the central sulcus. And so it controls the movements of our muscles, and just anterior to that is Broca's area. And the patient that Broca described experienced a difficulty in speaking, and specifically there was non-fluency. In other words, the person struggled to speak. The words didn't just flow. They had a really hard time getting the words out. In addition, they experienced anomia, a difficulty naming objects, finding the right noun, and their speech was agrammatic. It did not include often the articles, proper adjectives, adverbs, and so on. So they struggled to speak, and they did not use those other aspects of language, making their speech have a lack of grammar. But when they did manage to express themselves, there was meaning. So in Broca's aphasia, what's affected is the expression, but not the understanding of language. Wernicke in 1874 studied a patient with damage to this area here in the temporal lobe, and the individual was actually quite fluent. They spoke very easily, very fluidly, and very articulately, but it was absolutely meaningless. And the word we use for this is word salad. Yes, there's a bunch of words there, and they're all together, and they all flow really nicely, but they are absolutely devoid of meaning. So as an example, she's in the frim-fram. Means nothing. But the person would say these things very smoothly, very fluidly, like really the opposite of Broca's aphasia, right? Where they're struggling to come up with the words, they're having a hard time naming things. This individual has no trouble. They're just, it almost seems like they're making stuff up, right? They're making up words. But it's a function of, or at least it's thought to be a function of, the damage here to Wernicke's area. Comprehension here is completely affected. There's an inability to understand language, whether it's written or spoken. And so Wernicke's aphasia is referred to as a receptive aphasia, whereas Broca's aphasia is an expressive aphasia. Now, more recently, there's been a critical look at Broca's area and Wernicke's area, and trying to move beyond just those two areas to what other areas of the brain might be involved in language, and also looking at the differences in different individuals who have strokes and how their language functions are affected. And so based on this more comprehensive type of research, not just basing it on a single case study, but on numerous individuals who've suffered brain damage, we've developed, or the field has developed, what's called the Wernicke-Geschwin model of language. And the Wernicke-Geschwin model of language involves, yes, Broca's area, and yes, Wernicke's area, but look at all of these other areas that are implicated. So the visual cortex is involved because the first step in reading is seeing that visual input. That information gets sent here to these language areas in the temporal lobe, and we see the angular gyrus being involved in that, sort of transferring the written to the auditory part of language. And then information gets sent forward here to Broca's area, and then to the motor cortex to actually form the mouth movements that'll help us speak. Spoken input is heard through the auditory cortex, and then that information also gets sent into Wernicke's area. So whether we hear something or we see something, it gets processed in Wernicke's area for meaning, and then sent to Broca's area to help us express and be able to say what we just heard or read. So that's the model. Now when we look at patients who've suffered brain damage and we see what was affected depending on where their damage was, we see that there's not really a clear-cut pattern. And so if we look here, for example, the gray bar referring to articulation. And this would be the percentage of patients who had damage, say, in this zone, who had difficulty speaking, articulating what they're trying to say. This is consistent with Broca's area. They have a hard time articulating, and sure enough, individuals with damage to this more frontal part of the brain do show a high level of difficulty articulating. But we also see quite a number of individuals with damage here, a little further back in the brain, more posterior, who are also having that same difficulty. In contrast, if we look at comprehension, shown here in yellow, we can see that comprehension is greatly affected with damage to this part of the brain, here in the parietal cortex, but also here in the temporal cortex. And so a pattern does kind of emerge that, number one, the areas outlined in the Wernicke-Geschlin model are not the only ones involved in language. Number two, damage to these areas did not necessarily lead to aphasia. There are a lot of cases of individuals having damage to Broca's area and not showing Broca's aphasia. Same thing with Wernicke's aphasia. So they might have damage to Wernicke's area, but they actually don't show that's difficulty in comprehension. What we do see is that in general, with lots of variation, damage to more frontal areas of the brain are more likely to lead to difficulty speaking, whereas damage to the temporal areas are more likely to lead to comprehension difficulties. Let's take a look at now dyslexia and see what's going on with dyslexia a little bit. So these are images taken during reading. These are PET scans, and so the brighter colors, the yellows and the reds, indicate more brain activity. And we can see that when an individual is looking at just these shapes, letter-like forms, but they're not letters, we see just some very basic activity here in the visual cortex. When we have a string of consonants that we really can't pronounce, not much brain activity either. A little more activity here in the frontal lobe, but not much. Now, when it's a string of letters that we can easily pronounce, like tweel, it's not a real word, but we can pronounce it, we start seeing more activity in the visual cortex, and more of this activity kind of feeding forward here into the temporal cortex, and the angular gyrus being involved in sort of sending this information here to the temporal cortex. Now, when it's a real word, we see even more activity, and more activity in particular in this temporal cortex area. So reading real and fake words stimulated the visual projection areas in the occipital lobe, in other words, visual cortex, as well as the auditory and visual association areas in the temporal and in the parietal cortex. This happens through this angular gyrus that basically mediates and sends information between the visual areas to the language areas. Viewing letter-like shapes or just a string of consonants did not do that. One thing that we can take from this is that the processing of sound is critical in language. And in fact, that is one thing that is affected in dyslexia. It's often considered to be a difficulty in phonological processing. That's why we see the processing of a pronounceable string of letters like tweel affecting language areas in a way that's similar to a real word, because we don't know that it's a word or not, in essence, until we pronounce it. And so the phonological processing of a non-word is going to engage a lot of the same brain areas as the phonological processing of a real word. Now, dyslexia, of course, involves impaired reading. Again, phonological processing is key with that. And we see that the right hemisphere, Wernicke's area, called the planum temporale, which, again, this includes Wernicke's area, is normally larger on the left. And we're going to see this pattern where the left hemisphere is dominant for language in general. And in individuals with dyslexia, it will be a different pattern where the right side may be larger or they're both even. So we don't see the typical pattern in individuals with dyslexia where the left planum temporale is larger. Instead, we see that the right planum temporale might be larger. In addition, on the left side, we see that the neurons are not organized as neatly as they would be in a non-dyslexic individual, a person who did not have dyslexia. So here we see, number one, that all the neurons kind of lined up and came up this far to the surface of the cortex, and then that they were organized into these relatively neat columns that all process information together. In an individual with dyslexia, we don't see that nice neat row at the top where all the neurons sort of stopped on their movement to the surface of the cortex, and we see instead that there's just a general disorganization, and we don't see as many of these neat columns of neurons, so that we're seeing that prenatally during brain development the neurons in individuals with dyslexia may not be lining up the same way, and so this is a difficulty in the migration of the neurons that typically happens during neural development, during brain development. When we look at the big picture in terms of what the biological mechanisms for language includes, is that the left hemisphere is dominant for speech. The right hemisphere, however, is necessary and it is involved in developing an ear for the rhythm of speech, figuring out the meaning, and especially the emotional content of speech. And in addition, we see that the human brain is definitely predisposed to learn language. In fact, there are responses to language even before birth. Now let's take a look at some of the language areas of the brain in hearing and deaf individuals. So on the left side here, this is a result of brain imaging using fMRI in individuals while they read. And this is just using English. On the right, we have brain activity in a group of subjects who were deaf from birth while they were processing sign language. So instead of reading, using sign language. And we can see that a lot of the same areas are involved in both. And so these language areas are not specific to the modality or the form of language, but in the processing of the language itself. Now, how about in an individual who speaks more than one language? So this is an interesting study looking at bilingual participants. And what we see is that, in general, bilingual participants use slightly different areas for each language, but they're in the same region. So we can see here, subject 2, the green dots refer to areas of the brain involved in English. The yellow refer to areas of the brain involved in Spanish. And here we see the same thing in this participant and in this participant. Now, they're clearly all in the same general region, but there are distinct spots that seem to do each language. This is especially true if the two languages were learned at different times. Then we see a greater division between the English area and the Spanish area. Now, because an individual who's bilingual may use slightly different regions of their brain or parts of the brain to process each language, it means that when a person has a stroke, it might impair their speech in one language but not the other. And your textbook describes a woman who lived in the US who spoke Arabic as a first language and then English as a second language. She had a stroke and she lost the ability to speak English. Her solution was, when she had to speak to a neighbor or something like that, when she had to speak English, she'd call relatives in Lebanon, speak Arabic to them, and then they would translate for her. So that's a great example of how stroke might impair speech in one language but not the other.